Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, a quick guide to 243. For those of you that don't know about us, Spark TS specializes in FRA regulations. We have RailTasker and PeopleTasker, which is our software to help companies manage all these requirements. And within our software, we have things like OJT checklists and testing, operations tests, safety alerts, qualifications and certifications, all to help railroads and contractors manage FRA requirements. We're also a third-party administrator for drug and alcohol screening and record keeping. We do DAT testing and things like MVR checks to help stay compliant with DOT regulators. Finally, we have a training library, which includes online FRA courses and checklists for Part 243. Our speakers for today are Katie Inoue and Paul Rogowski, and I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Thanks, Diane. That was Diane Reimer. For those of you that have worked with Diane or know Diane, she's our main point of contact for a lot of you managing our support inbox and implementations. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Katie Inoue. I'm the Vice President of North America and founder of Spark TS. I'm really excited to talk about 243 today. It felt like I'd never stopped talking about it a few years back. Every webinar and blog post and conference topic, we were speaking about 243, and it's really been some time. So looking forward to today's webinar. And then really quick about me, I've been in the industry since 2012. I was recruited by a Class 1 to help them with Part 243, was part of their training team as an instructional designer, and then moved to regulatory affairs, and then founded Spark in 2016. And then I'll pass it over to Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Rogowski. I'm the Director of Professional Services for RailTasker. Been with Spark almost a year now. Prior to that, though, very similar background to Katie. I was hired by a Class 1 to do their 243 submittal. I also became the RailTasker admin when we brought RailTasker on. I was a customer prior to working at Spark. Got an instructional design background. I was doing instructional design, stand-up instruction prior to that. And yeah, I've slowly become a 243 expert, quote unquote, over the years.
Yeah.
Good to talk to everybody today.
So glad when Paul joined us a year ago or so to have two of us in-house to help with 243. For today, we're going to do a little bit of a test your knowledge. For those of you who don't know what Kahoot is and have kids in school, they might know it's just a simple online quiz game that we're going to play, just 10 questions, which will be fun. And then I'm going to talk a little bit high level of an overview of 243. And really my personal goal on this webinar is, we talk about the regulation a lot. My goal is to take a step back, look at the regulation in a way that isn't overwhelming and just buckets the requirements in a simplistic way. That said, and as I said in my intro, I've been talking about 243 for a while. I have quite a bit of free resources, other webinars. Paul and I did a webinar where we did a deep dive into refresher training. I've done a deep dive on just managing contractors. So the other part of this goal of this webinar is to get all those resources in front of you, which leads into what Paul will be talking about. For those of you who are using RailTasker, you've either met with Paul or I to put together your 243 plan, and Paul's going to talk a little bit about how that template works. And we will answer questions along the way, but we'll also have time at the end to pick up any questions that we missed. And with that, I'm going to get started with your phones are ready. We're gonna bring over Kahoot. I think you all see it. Oh, let me start this. In order to play, please feel free to scan the QR code. You don't have to, and we won't spend too long on the Kahoot, but I think it's a fun way to just get us thinking about 243. And also, maybe I picked questions that I wanted to highlight as well. I am gonna go ahead and start the Kahoot. All right, which is not an example of a safety sensitive employee? You should see on your phone your choices. You have 30 seconds to respond. All right, so a train crew caller. A dispatcher is a safety sensitive employee under, so any hours of service employee, which would include a dispatcher. Just keep going. Oh, and you guys get points too. That's our leaderboard. According to FRA, what is one of the main safety improvements of 243? So what's one of the main purposes? You guys think? Requiring hands-on training and assessment, requiring host railroad specific RWP training, increasing documentation of qualifications, or improving hazmat training for incident response. Correct. Most of you got it. A lot of this is all about hands-on training. I didn't say OJT, but that is a form of hands-on training. All right. True or false? All railroad refresher training is required every 36 months. Oh, you guys are like fast on this one. I'll call it. That is false. Under 243, it's tricky. Yes, we do need training over 243, but 243 does say unless the regulation requires a different, amount of time for refresher training. So on-track safety, things like that, CWR required every calendar year and still fall under 243. All right, you need a designated instructor to complete all training under 243, true or false? Any other takers? Oh, there we go. Correct. This was split 50-50, you guys, but pretty close. False. The key here is all training. I can talk a little bit about it. We do need designated instructors. Truthfully, something that I called out to Rob and JR not that long ago, and something I've always thought about and talked about is the regulation only brings up designated instructors when it comes to on-the-job training. And I think it's a misconception in the industry that designated instructors apply across all training. And even in on-the-job training, you can work with those peer trainers or qualified people. So definitely have more flexibility than meets the eye. True or false? You can replace OJT with hands-on classroom training and assessments. True. It is true. You need that hands-on component, and if you're replacing hands-on training in the classroom with on-the-job training, my recommendation is always do the same level of documentation. And keep in mind, on-the-job training is both a method of training of how we teach people and also the assessment tools. If you're doing that in the classroom, you want to have hands-on practice as a method, and then the assessment should be hands-on as well. All right. Which safety-related employee does not need on-the-job training? Who would not need on-the-job training under 243? We good? Couple of seconds if you want to get your answers in. All right. Roadway workers is the right answer. I know it seems tricky, but if a true roadway worker, they're not using a radio, they're not handling switches and derails, they really do not need on-the-job training. And that's really the only job category where this is true. Of course, that changes if they start, if they're gonna handle a switch or something like that. But there is one example of an employee that does not need OJT. Okay. True or false? 3 more questions. Signal training does not need to be submitted to the FRA. Do you need to submit your signal training? Crossings, wayside signals, 234, 235, 233, 236, I did not say those in order. That is false. You do need to submit your training for your Signal employees. And so we can talk about submissions a little bit more, but if there's a training requirement in the regulation, it is exempt. That is not the case with Signal training. Now we are on the edge of having a Signal certification, which is now delayed a year. Thank you, FRA. This could likely change, but as it stands today, you do need your Signal training submitted. We got just a couple questions left. All right, true or false? It is difficult to update a training submission with the FRA. This guy thinks so in the picture. What do you guys think? Some of you may have done it, some maybe not. And obviously this is probably the most objective question, but it is false in my opinion. We have a little how-to video, but you can update the training fairly easily. So don't not change your training programs because there's a submission attached. It's not that hard to change the submission. It's a lot harder to do things you don't want to be doing from a business perspective. 9 and 10. Oh, 2 more now, sorry. Which safety-related employee needs hands-on freight car inspections under 243? Your carmen, conductors, all employees performing freight car inspections, all employees of a railroad performing freight car inspections. I've never done the Kahoot before, Paul. This is actually fun. I don't know. All employees performing freight car inspections is correct for the 4 of you that said that. Yes, railroad employees, so those of you that answered the green one, but railroad contractors also are included in Part 243. There is a nuance and you could make a case if you're really thinking in the weeds if the car is owned by the car owner and not the railroad, but a railroad contractor doing freight car inspections for a railroad does need that training. Last question. Contractors must always have a 243 submission letter to show railroads. Whether you're a railroad contractor or railroad itself, this comes up a lot, according to the FRA. That is false. If you're a Signal contractor, the answer is true, but the always. If you're a track, you're a maintenance away and contractor, or I guess that's the best example, and also the highest quantity of our contractors, they technically don't need an FRA approval letter. Railroads often like to ask for that, but that is not required under 243, despite what ISN says. I think we have a podium. I'm going to close the Kahoot. Hopefully you guys enjoyed testing your knowledge and get back to the presentation. Obviously, I can spend hours talking about 243, and truthfully I have, but doing 243 plans, a lot of times I like to talk to people like, do you know what 243 is? Can we summarize it really high level? And then the last year or so, this is how I've just primed to break it down to keep 243 more simple. If we think about what is it requiring of us as an industry, the biggest thing is on the left here, initial qualification of our employees based on their occupational category. That includes hands-on training, and OJT, as many of you noticed, that is the main purpose, is encompassing hands-on training when it's appropriate. In fact, I had in the Kahoot written hands-on trainings required when there's neuromuscular coordination, which is what the 243 regulation says. Kahoot thought that was too many characters, and I don't disagree with Kahoot on that. But that is really the center of 243. I was talking to a railroad not too long ago, a couple weeks ago, and one of their departments had been doing the hands-on training and had some gaps on the knowledge training. And my answer to them is, we will fix the knowledge piece, but to get you guys addressing those gaps, but the emphasis is the hands-on training. At least they got the meat and potatoes of it. And of course, there is a submission likely approved with that initial qualification. And then from there, it's about the initial qualification of employees and then keeping them trained. So we talked about the refresher training cycles in the Kahoot. If there isn't a cycle under the regulations, it is every 36 months. Those of you that answered that is true, but sometimes it's shorter, and CWR and on-track safety is definitely good examples of that. Things that didn't have refresher training cycles that now do. Air brake handling rules, 232 is what I want to say, like single car air brake tests or things like that, or just our air brake tests for our trains. Those were every 36 months already. But for things like track inspection under 213 or our mechanical regulations or 215 and 229 that didn't normally have refresher training, signal, now they do, and that's every 36 months. And then the last piece of this is we don't want to forget about the periodic oversight. And for railroads, sometimes we take that for granted because we had our 217 plans, and yes, you can use 217 for your periodic oversight. It does require you to update your plan. If you haven't updated your 217 plan since 243 went into effect, or you have updated it but not thinking about Part 243, you probably need to. The Short Line Association updated their template to stay in step with the 243 requirements. But for contractors who think 243 is all about just training, they need a periodic oversight plan, and that is a large component of the regulation. And then underlying all of that is the administration of having a new regulation and things like record keeping, maintaining a list of your contractors. Some of you on the line had to notify your labor organization. So if you have labor organizations as a railroad, you have to notify them the same time you're doing your submissions under 243 and the annual reviews. But if you're a contractor or a short line, you don't have to worry about annual reviews. That's really our class 1 friends. That's how I like to look at it really simplistically. From there, I have put together a compliance checklist, and Diane did mention the handout. This PowerPoint is in the handouts. There's not a lot of detail like necessarily on this slide, but I have in a couple slides a link to all of the blogs and past webinars on 243 by topics. So you might want that for that purpose. You can dig deeper onto any of these topics. The compliance checklist I have as a detailed handout to talk through. But from a summary high-level perspective, you need to have that initial training program. Number 1 goes with this initial qualification right here. You have to have a program for each of your job categories on how you initially train and qualify employees. That is something that Paul's going to show you, the tools we've created at Spark, and something I've been using even before I founded Spark with class 1s to create a template for that. That template knocks out several of these actually and includes that refresher training piece as well. If it applies, number 2, you do need to serve copies to your labor organizations, and when you're doing substantial changes to the plan, that would still apply. You need to begin periodic oversight when the regulation went into effect. And for a lot of us, that deadline has long passed. If you're a contractor and you're like, periodic oversight, what is that? And I thought I was good because I was training my employees. It's not too late. There's definitely a lot of resources available to get you up and running on periodic oversight. And if you're using RailTasker, the great thing is that our LMS, our checklist tool, our qualifications manual helps with number 1. The periodic oversight is in operations testing. So if you're using RailTasker, that tool is meant for you to do your periodic oversight. Maintaining a list of contractors for our railroads on the call, same list likely as your 219 contractors. I like to emphasize, make sure your contractors say they're compliant with 243 and have them explicitly say the hands-on training components and periodic oversight, just because those two are so critical in the compliance and often overlooked. And with periodic oversight in particular, if you have an accident or incident, and I hope that never is the case for your property, FRA is going to look at the periodic oversight. You want to have an agreement with that contractor and knowledge that they're doing that on their behalf. Otherwise, that falls onto you. You do need to grandfather in your existing employees back from May 1st of 2021. That has long passed, but you should have those records internally. The annual review, and if you download the compliance checklist, there's details and sub-bullets and links for all of these topics. Likely not applicable for most of you on the call, and I didn't go through the whole list. Sometimes we have class 1s join us, but I know they're all handling this, so it wouldn't be no surprise. And then maintaining records, which goes into our next slide. There's some details here we can take a look at of all the records that need to be maintained. I have this blog post that you can take a look at that goes into all the record keeping documentation. But of course, if you're using Railtasker, LMS, and the app, if you're using the systems correctly, you can leverage the systems for your record keeping, so you don't have to worry about 6 years. It's in perpetuity at Railtasker unless you delete a user. Don't delete a user, make them inactive. All of these would be included in your Railtasker documents, but if you're doing something different or you just want to check, this is a great way of checking to make sure you have all those checks and balances. The thing I want to call out about periodic oversight is you do need the records that you did an operations test or you conducted periodic oversight on an employee, but you also need a plan. If you are a contractor, FRA has some guidance, the Short Line Association has a very straightforward plan you can use, but you should have a document that says, here's the test we perform, this is how many tests we're going to perform a year. You need an actual plan, not just doing the Railtasker tests inside the app. Talked about grandfathering in that list of documentation. Now in Railtasker, you can designate a checklist. You'll soon be able to designate a qualification. And so those records can be maintained right there. You have your designated instructors list, which again, in the OJT checklist app in Railtasker, that's available and you can export at any time. Talked about the list of contractors a couple of times here. And my goal again is we're just looking at this at like bird's eye view, trying to give you some tools that you can take back and just assess where you're at a program level and give you some checks and balances. If you take a look at, in particular, your compliance checklist, that handout, and then can you point to records in your organization that where your qualification status is for all of your employees? Who are your qualified track inspectors and what is their qualification date? Can you answer that? Same thing about Carmen. Where's their OJT records? Just a good check on where you at our program level. And the majority of you are using Railtasker, and I know it's a big application and it takes time to implement different pieces of it, but if you need help, our support email and Diane, who's on the call, we're all here to help you. We really want you to be successful, and we can help you leverage that technology and answer other questions in more detail. As I'm wrapping up sort of the summary of my part of 243 from a bird's eye view, just random thoughts on things that I think people forget when thinking about the regulation that I just want to call out. We talked about OJT records are critical. If it's not documented, it's not done from a compliance liability perspective. And I think a lot of times we're doing the right things, but making sure you have OJT records, whether you're using our checklist tool. Now you can actually upload a paper checklist into the checklist tool if there's a one-off. So making sure you have those records for all of your employees. And I would say it's so critical that if you're missing records, create them. Go back and make sure you go back and do it. And you can make a note that they were previously lost or something. Now, if you're grandfathering people in, that's a little different. Second bullet point, you cannot grandfather in your crane operators. So the crane operator, the roadway maintenance machines equipped with a crane, that was introduced with the final rule, the original final rule of Part 243, and it amended 214. It went into effect in Part 214 well before May 1st of 2021. If I thought hard enough, I could give you the date, but that's not important. The important thing is that you need your on-the-job training records and your full training records for all your RMM operators. That is not something that can be designated. Other things people forget, if you had to submit training for initial training with FRA, you're gonna have to submit your refresher training. You need to submit your mechanical training, your mechanical refresher training, something to call out. Paul has worked with FRA. We have refresher training checklists you can leverage. So we have basically parallel refresher training checklists that have a duration, learning objectives that you can use for this purpose. You can adopt our checklist, but you do need to submit them if it's a mechanical checklist or a signal checklist. Track inspection does not need to be submitted. And then not all roadway maintenance machines should be treated equal. I think FRA is looking for some differentiation of training your RMM operators. Now, as a short line, and many of you are fairly small, sure, if you have two pieces of equipment and they're very similar, I'll give you that. But if, you know, a tamper and a spiker, they're very different pieces of equipment. Some categorization of your RMMs is expected. The class when I worked at, when I categorized our RMMs, I had them in 33 categories, and I still have the safety critical book from that job that I did. It was before Rail Taskers. I had the checklist with like carbon copies that you could give the employee. We had 33 categories. I know one class one that has over 100 categories, but some thoughtfulness, even if it's 2 or 3, I think makes sense. We talked about roadway workers not needing on-the-job training, but a second that somebody's using a radio, handling switches and derails, that changes, and they do need on-the-job training. Contractors in general are just held to the same standards as railroads, same standards as periodic oversight, same standards for training. The exceptions would be like annual reviews and things like that. They're more in that short line category, but it's the same standard. If they're under the regulation as a safety sensitive railroad, safety sensitive employee, then that's the wrong terminology. Paul, help me out here. Railroad, safety. It's not safety sensitive. 243 definition, maybe it is. I think I'm overthinking it. I've been talking to Holly too much about, but anyways, it's the same standard. And then one thing that I was talking to FRA about a couple of years ago, and just for awareness, railroads keep contractor lists. If you're a contractor, that doesn't apply to you, but if you're using subcontractors, you're just equally responsible to make sure that they are compliant. And you can do that by, you should make sure that they're compliant for the job that they're doing, and that company has a 243 plan. Be careful, because certainly you don't need a contractor list, but if you're using subcontractors, yes, you do. You do need to consider that. And then people forget, especially contractors, that they need a plan for periodic oversight. It's not just about doing it. Making sure you have an actual document that says this is what our periodic plan is under Part 243. So much stuff to cover in the regulation. This is a link of the compliance checklist. Some of these are webinars, some of these are blog posts, but I would say most topics under 243 would be covered in the content that I've been writing since 2020 and the webinars that I've been doing. Some of them are with, I've done multiple webinars with FRA. I've highlighted a couple of them here. I think this one's with Rob Castiglione, the refresher training requirements with Corey Johnson, and Paul and I did this refresher training with RWP training. But really, I think my goal was to always create a library of resources, and here is a good library of resources for you all to dig deeper. So
I am also not seeing any questions.
Yeah, so with that, I'm going to give it over to Paul.
Thanks, Katie. For those of you that have worked with Katie or I on creating your 243 plan have probably seen this already. This is something, like Katie said, she started a while back, and we've revised it and improved it over the years. And it does cover most of the information you need for your 243 plan. Just basically on the left-hand side here, we start with our course IDs. These are any Spark courses that we have, and if it's not a Spark course we have, we identify that if it's something that needs to be provided by a railroad, or if it's something that the ASLRA provides, there'll be just be a dash and let you know what it is. If you're adopting our courses, these are the course IDs for the different training things we have. Next to that, you have the course name, obviously that it corresponds to that ID. And then we also list the applicable CFR parts for each of those courses. So this is something that has to be identified for your 243 submission, what you're training them on, what is covered in each course. And we list that there in the CFR parts. We then identify if something is OJT with an X mark, with an X in the box next to there. We also identify what needs to be submitted. If you have questions about what needs to be submitted and you don't have one of these plans, the 243 compliance guide has several pages 8 through 11 actually, in the compliance guide list everything that does not need to be submitted. You still have to train on those things. They just don't have to be submitted to the FRA for approval prior to you training on them. You can see up at the top here, that first one, the safety regs for all employees has to be submitted, but the next ones that cover the 219 don't need to be submitted. Again, you do have to do the training on them. You just don't have to submit it as part of your plan. If it's a model program, we'll have that box marked. All of Spark's programs that are out there are model programs, so all of ours will be marked. When you adopt them, when you go into the FRA portal, you just adopt them as a model program, and that's just identifying if it is a model program or not. We also list refresher training requirements over here on in the last column here on the left-hand side to let you know when refresher training is required for those. As Katie said, we do have several approved checklists by the FRA that can be used for refresher training. They work just like your OJT checklists, but they are training courses because they have objectives, they have timeframes, but they can be signed off and work right through Railtasker in your checklist module to meet most of the refresher training requirements. There are a few, if you have adopted ours, that require additional training. For example, if you adopt our machinist refresher training checklist, you do still have to do 232 classroom training on top of the refresher training checklist. That's something the FRA wanted to point out. Make sure if you've adopted ours, there are a handful that have additional training requirements to meet that refresher training, and that's in the requirements in the checklist itself. The rest of the spreadsheet is basically your job categories. We try to break them up by the most common job titles or job duties. As we go through these, you can modify those if you have different job titles. Obviously, if you don't have certain work that you do, if you don't run trains, if you don't have engineers, you don't have conductors, you can just delete those columns. Obviously, they don't apply to you. But then as you mark these for the different job titles, next to the courses that are required, this turns into your 243 plan. You've got your employees identified by job category or job type. You've got the courses that you're training them on. You've got the regulations that you're training them on. You've identified OJT for the different courses. And you've also identified the refresher training in there. It's, like I said, it works very well. Katie worked a long time on it, and we've updated it over the years. And again, those of you that have gone through a plan with Katie or I, you've seen this before, but it's a really good tool to use for your 243 plan. We also do, when you get the spreadsheet, when we go through this with you, there's a second page on there that is for designating employees. If you do have employees that can be designated or grandfathered in, you can identify them on that second sheet as part of your documentation you have to have for 243 as well.
I was going to bring it up for you if you'd like. There we go. So we've got the second.
This, just identifies the employee, their username or employee ID, and then the job title that you're designating them into.
I'll just add a couple of things, Paul. That's great. These job categories, you covered it, but just for emphasis. These categories, the job titles are whatever, job categories, whatever you want to call them. And if something doesn't apply, delete it. Whatever you have here, obviously it's going to match over here. If you look at the record keeping requirements in 243, this template between these two tabs knocks out a lot of them. It's your initial plan, it's your job category matrix with your CFR matrix and your grandfathering in. Like, it's quite a bit of stuff all in one. So it checks several boxes. Anything, Paul, you want to add?
No, I don't think so. We do, if you looked at this too, we do have additional items on there that aren't 243 related. We just identify them in there to let you know that training is required. They're generally down towards the bottom, things like conductor training, engineering training, DSLE, that aren't necessarily 243 related, but it may be training that your employees require. Security awareness is another one, big one from the TSA.
Mm-hmm. And we put not 243 under this admission, but yeah. And these are in yellow because really we don't want to change how you're doing your certifications. We just want to talk through how you're documenting them. And the other thing is, this can be a living document. A lot of you may have gone through this with me in 2021 and things have changed operationally, or you've swapped out different courses. Just create versions of it. So if you know, like, this person was trained under our 243 plan based on the 2021 version, and we updated in 2024. And of course, if it has submissions, like we talked about at the start of the webinar, you'll need to update, either doing an informational filing or change the course that's in the plan. But it can be somewhat of a living document. You just want to keep your submission in check with what you're doing here. And you want to keep this accurate for what you're actually doing. Make sure it's maintained and that somebody at the organization knows where this is. I have seen some railroads give a copy of these to every department head. And the only concern I have with that is the mechanical manager might make changes and the engineering person might make changes. And okay, who has the actual 243 plan, the one example? So No, it's good. Thank you. All right.
I've got a couple of questions here. Do you have to include the 243 spreadsheet in the FRA portal for approval? For
your submission
Yeah.
or for grandfather?
Yeah.
You don't have to submit grandfathering records. I think I heard you say grandfathering. You just have to have that list of people you've identified that you're grandfathering in, which is that second tab. And as far as submitting it as a plan, if you take out the items that don't need to be submitted, you can use this as your submissions. If you delete the columns that don't require submission, and you just, right, like Katie just did, she just filtered it. I would take them out if you're going to submit it to as your FRA submission, just so that they're not even in there.
And I'll just add, we expected this industry when I was working at a class 1 and we first saw the portal. We were expecting to submit, to Diane's point, a plan. And that's not how it works. You submit individual courses. There's nowhere to submit your plan. And the same thing with the periodic oversight. You don't need to submit that to FRA under 243. You just need to have it. The other thing is you need to say, okay, under 243, how do we qualify our machinists? If I take out the empties here, this is going to be the curriculum that is required for a machinist. Take away the hazmat stuff under 243. And they have 9 courses, 3 of which are refresher only. So they have 6 initial courses, and then they're going to have 3 rules courses that are required every 3 years. You have to be able to answer that question to FRA, and this tool helps you do that.
One more question. If the spreadsheet says model program, do we have to adopt those courses in the portal if there's no check mark next to submit?
Do you have to adopt them in the portal if it doesn't say submit?
Yes, but it does say model program.
Submit says whether or not you put it in the portal. If it does not say submit, you can use it and not submit it in the portal.
Before we close, I'd like to thank everyone for sharing part of your day with us. Before you leave, please be sure to download the compliance checklist and today's webinar. And finally, if you have any questions about anything you've heard today, please email us at support@sparkts.net and we'll get those answered for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.